I was thinking with the kids singing today, we got to experience a number of their choirs. I believe we have more children and kids involved in choirs and music than any time since I've been here at St. Luke's. And Karen Allison Drini is the reason why, and she's just doing a great job. So I'm sorry she got out the door and didn't get a chance to hear me say that, but I hope you will encourage her. Some years ago, a guy named Robert Fulgham wrote a book, All I Really Needed to Know, I Learned in Kindergarten. If I were writing a book like that, it would probably be titled, All I Really Needed to Know, I Learned Riding the School Bus. For instance, I learned that you don't want to be in the far back of the bus. That's where the trouble comes from. The kids who sit in the back of the bus are purposely trying to get as far away from the driver as possible. Back of the bus. The first dirty words I ever learned came from the back of the bus. But the ones who ride in the front of the bus are the rule followers. And they are the ones who let the bus driver know who's not following the rules. And then there are those who are kind of in the middle of the bus. You know, they're not rule followers, they're not tattling, but they don't want to be in the problem crowd. They don't want to be with the folks over here. They're just in the middle. I was a middle of the bus rider. I remember about the first or second grade, there was a girl who rode the bus on the bus I rode, and she was just this bright, vivacious, very confident girl. The way that she would respond to teachers, ask questions, answer questions, I just thought, wow, I wish I had that kind of confidence. Which meant that she was highly favored by teachers, which meant that she would also be an object of jealousy from other kids. One afternoon, riding the bus home, I became aware of a commotion from the back of the bus, not all that unusual. Couple of boys sounded like they were just chanting this name over and over, and I turned around and then I could see that they were directing their taunts at this girl. And I could see by the look on her face, she didn't like it. And she finally turned around to them and said, "Stop it." Now, what do you think that did? That just egged them on even more. A couple of boys. You notice how it always starts with boys. Boys are usually the instigators. But other kids started joining in. I mean, a lot of other kids. And they all started chanting this name that obviously they had learned got on the nerves of this girl, and they turned it into a taunt. Over, louder, louder. Her protest got louder. She said, "Stop it, I don't like that, stop it." Now, I guess the bus driver was so used to commotions coming from the back of the bus, she didn't pay any attention to it. But when the bus pulled to her stop and she got off, the girl ran down the aisle to get off that bus as fast as she could. When she passed me, I could tell she was just sobbing. She got off the bus, and the kids in the back lowered the window so that they could keep yelling out the window as the bus pulled away. And I saw the girl walking up the road crying with her hands over her ears. What I learned on the back of the bus that day is if enough voices come together, they can tear down the most confident of souls. The question of Jesus we're considering today is one that is especially important for anybody who's ever felt torn down by criticism or condemnation. It's Jesus' question: where are your accusers? Now, it's a very simple question, but the conditions surrounding it are anything but. I want to look at this story from the perspective of two different levels of accusation, because we see both levels in this story. And the first level of accusation is this: accusation for things you don't deserve. That is very much in this story. It starts with religious leaders bringing a woman to Jesus they say was caught in the act of adultery. Just how did they catch her in the act? Was a jealous husband involved? Out of his suspicion, did he call the religious police to do a stakeout? What, did they hide in the closet? How long do you think they looked before they acted? There was a rabbinic tradition at the time that said if you see your fellow Israelite about to sin and you can stop that person, you're obligated to do so. So much for the religious leaders following rabbinic tradition. And so much for them following the Torah. When they brought her to Jesus, they said the law says to stone her, a form of executing a person. What do you say? Now, actually, that's not what the law says. What they're referencing comes from Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Where's the man? I knew that would get an amen from few of the women in the crowd, because after all, it does take more than one to commit adultery. Where's the other person? Why? The woman. It's interesting, isn't it, how prejudice and biblical faithfulness can be a good cover for each other. Just a thought. But the story gives us insight into the reasons of the religious leaders doing this. The religious leaders were trying to trap Jesus into saying something they could use against him. Now, what that meant was if they could get Jesus to say, no, I don't agree with the law, she doesn't deserve death, then they could accuse him of disobeying Mosaic law. If he agreed with them, what would that do to his followers? What would that do to the people who were coming around Jesus, people he was attracting to him because of his love of forgiveness and mercy? So they're trying to trap him. What you see here, what you can tell is going on, is that these men do not care one bit about the woman. They don't care what she did or really what happens to her. They only want to accuse because they have another agenda. She is nothing more than bait. They have another agenda, and it just points out that there are those in the world who just want to accuse people. And when they do, it reveals they've got another agenda going on. I mean, some people just want to accuse because that's what they need to do to feel better about themselves. In order for them to feel good about who they are, they need to make you feel less about who you are. It's just what some people do. Some people just want to accuse because they're getting even. They have been hurt by you. But rather than come and acknowledge that and talk it out, they need to hurt you back. Some people just want to accuse because of prejudice. They look to find something you're doing wrong, not because of who you are, but because of the color of your skin, but because of your sexual orientation, because you are a woman, because you are the nationality that you are. There are all kinds of reasons that make people just want to accuse. But when you are just being accused by somebody, you can just about guarantee there's another agenda going on. Have you ever had to live with accusations you didn't deserve? Have you ever had to live with words spoken to you like you're unworthy, you're a failure, you haven't done enough, you're ugly, you'll never amount to anything? Some of you, when you hear those words, you go in your mind, you go right back to the moment you first heard them. You go back to the school bus. You go back to the time you were a little boy or girl and a parent said something to you. You go back to the coach who spoke to you, or the neighbor or another kid at school. You can remember the very moment because it holds that kind of reality inside of you. But, and this is so important, but Not everyone who accuses you does so out of wrong motives. Not everybody who accuses has a wrong motive. We all have faults. We all need people to help us see ourselves as we really are. But there's a difference between a critic and a prophet. Critics just want to stay on the sideline and tear down. Prophets will speak truth, but they'll get in the game with you because they care about you and they want things to be better in your life. Prophets in the Old Testament could be brutally honest, but they always gave pictures of a better future. The point is to know the difference. There's a story about jazz musician Cab Calloway, one time at a famous jazz club, introducing a young, talented saxophone player. The young man got up, performed his set, and when he finished, a self-appointed critic came up to him and said, "Young man, you ain't that good. All you can do is play like Charlie Parker." He said it when Cab Calloway was standing there. Before the young man could reply, Cab Calloway took the saxophone out of his hand, handed it to the critic, and said, "Well, then here, you play like Charlie Parker." I mean, think of all the different things that critic could have said. He could have gone up to him and said, "You're already playing like Charlie Parker. You're going places." We don't always have a Cab Calloway to help us distinguish the difference. How do we do that? How can we tell the difference between a critic and a prophet? Let me offer some questions, and as much as anything, I hope this might stir your own thinking about what helps you distinguish between those who just want to criticize you and those who will present truth to you because you know they care about you and they want to help. Here are some examples. Is someone just telling me what I can't do, or do they also point out things I can do? Is someone just making me feel worse, or also encouraging me to believe I can be better? Are there people who show up only when I fail to point it out? Are there people who show up only when I do well? And are there people who show up at both times? What other ways can you think of? What helps you distinguish between somebody who just wants to criticize and probably has another agenda and people who really care about you? That is important when we are dealing with accusations we don't deserve, but there's the other level of accusation in this story. The accusation for things we do deserve. That too is in the story. The fact is, the woman committed adultery. She committed moral failure. She sinned. And it's been paraded in front of the whole village. I mean, just imagine all of her family. If she has children, there's no hiding it. Neighbors, God. When the religious leader said, "She deserves to be stoned to death," can't you imagine that woman saying, "Oh, please do. Please. How am I ever going to go on with my life? Please end my life right now." But it says, Jesus bent down on the ground and began to write with his finger. Now, there's been a lot of speculation ever since this gospel was written. What was Jesus writing in the ground? Some say he was writing the sins of the religious leaders. That they were, what? We don't know, we can't prove that. Some people say, no, what he was doing was doodling to give himself time to come up with a response. It's just kind of hard to believe Jesus needed time to think about what to say. Dr. Gail O'Day, New Testament scholar, says that's not it at all. She says to do such an action in that day and time in ancient Middle Eastern culture, it was a way of communicating to somebody, I'm not going to engage with you. It would be like, maybe you can think of a time when you're trying to have a tough conversation with a family member and they're watching TV and they're just ignoring you. You're talking, and they're not even looking up at you. You don't know if they're listening or not. You get between them and the TV and go, are you listening to me? And they go like this. Now, what are they telling you? Are they telling you, I want to watch TV right now? No, what they're telling you is, I'm not having this conversation. You could say that what Jesus was doing and doodling on the ground was giving the religious leaders the finger. I'm not going to engage that statement. But they won't quit. They hound and they hound and they hound like a bunch of kids on the school bus. So Jesus stands, straightens himself, and looks at them and says, let the one of you who goes without sin cast the first stone. Let's think about that for a moment. What is Jesus not saying? What does he not mean by that statement? I believe Jesus does not mean you better be perfect if you're going to judge somebody. I don't think he means that. I don't think he means you have to be without fault before you can ever point out fault in another person. If that were the case, we would never have a conviction in our country. Alec Murdaugh would be walking free right now. I believe what Jesus means is that all of us need to judge at times. We all have a certain moral responsibility within ourselves to call out fault in the lives of people we love and we care about. But we should never cast a judgment that we are not willing to live with ourselves. That we should also be willing to put ourselves under that same judgment. Because if we don't allow stuff to be called out in our lives, we just become fault finders. My dad, who just died back in January, after he retired, it was very uncharacteristic of him, but the house kind of fell into disrepair. And the back steps that are brick just have crumbled. Big cracks in the ceiling, paint chipping. But he didn't let us fix it. Dad, come on, let us just call some people. Let's get this thing. No, I got a plan. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to do this. No, he wouldn't let anybody fix anything. But here's the funny thing about my dad. When he came to visit us, he would no more than get in the door and say, you're going to need to do a little work on those steps there. You got some cracks up in your ceiling. Boy, this place could use a fresh coat of paint. It got to be kind of a joke in our family. We'd all just laugh about it. But it does remind us, we all tend to spot the faults in others we are most disappointed by in ourselves. We all can be like that. The things that we will look for in other people are the things in us we don't like. We wish we're different. We wish we were a lot better at doing. And those are the things that we will call out, and Jesus won't let the religious leaders get away with that. Let the one among you without sin cast the first stone. And we know what happened. One by one, from the oldest to the youngest, they began to just drop the stones they were going to throw at the woman to execute her and walk away. That left Jesus alone with the woman. And after everybody was gone, Jesus stood and looked at her, and he asked, "Where are your accusers?" It's the first time in this story that the woman was addressed directly, that anybody spoke to her. It's the first time she was not being treated like an object, but as a human being. But Jesus didn't give her time to answer. He quickly asked a follow-up. Is there no one to condemn you? She spoke the obvious. There's no one. And what Jesus says next, if we at all allow ourselves to put ourselves in the shoes of this woman, should make us weep. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Neither do I condemn you. But Jesus recognized, yes, you have sinned. Yes, you have failed. Yes, you've done something I know you'll probably regret the rest of your life. But it doesn't have to define you. You're worthy of a second chance. Go and sin no more. Colleagues of Robert Downey Jr., the actor, were asked one time, who would you rather be? Tony Stark, the fictional genius, billionaire superhero who plays Iron Man? Or would you rather be Robert Downey Jr. himself? And to Robert Downey Jr.'s shock, they said, we'd like to be Robert Downey Jr. Now, I say it's a shock because if you know anything about his life, you know it's been a roller coaster. He started out with this instant kind of Hollywood success, and then his drug addiction took over, and I mean hard drugs. Cocaine, heroin, he could not get free. Because he would show up late for film shoots, he got blacklisted by Hollywood. No one would have anything to do with him until Mel Gibson came along. Now, if you know anything about Mel Gibson's life, you know what's really interesting there is a short time after that, Mel Gibson had an alcohol-induced, racially laced outburst that made the news big time. And it landed him in Hollywood's wilderness. Well, when Robert Downey Jr. was awarded Comeback of the Year award, he asked that Mel Gibson present the award. And at that award ceremony, he said these words, I asked Mel to present this award to me because when I couldn't get sober, he told me not to give up hope. And he urged me to find my faith. Didn't have to be his or anyone else's as long as it was rooted in forgiveness. And I couldn't get hired, so he cast me in the lead of a movie that was actually developed for him. And he kept a roof over my head and food on the table. And most importantly, he said that if I accepted responsibility for my wrongdoings and if I embraced that part of my soul that was ugly, hugging the cactus, he calls it. He said that if I hugged the cactus long enough, I'd become a man of some humility and that my life would take on new meaning. And it did, and it worked. All he asked in return was that someday I help the next guy in some small way. It's reasonable to assume that at that time, he didn't imagine the next guy would be him or that someday would be tonight. So on this special occasion, I humbly ask that you join me unless you are completely without sin, in which case you picked the wrong profession. In forgiving my friend his trespasses, offering him the same clean slate you have offered to me, and allowing him to continue his great and ongoing contribution to our collective art without shame. He's hugged the cactus long enough. There comes a time we all need to hug the cactus. When we do things we regret, we need to acknowledge it without making excuses for ourselves and without blaming everybody else who's responsible. We need to own it ourselves so that we can receive with a heart that will trust it, that Jesus says, I don't condemn you. You deserve a second chance. Go back to the end of the story. And imagine the woman walking away after Jesus says that to her with rocks littering the ground. no one holding them anymore. What it says is when Jesus comes on the scene, accusers have to fade away. Accusers have to disappear. That there can be no one there anymore to tear her down, either inappropriately for things she doesn't deserve, as well as the things that she does deserve. And we all need to remember that. We all need to remember when we are struggling with the voices inside our heads telling us things we don't deserve, or maybe the worst voice of all, our own, reminding us of what we screwed up and how we aren't worthy of forgiveness. That we need to hold on to what Jesus says and remember that with him there are no accusers. As we close this morning, and Fran's coming up to get us started in a moment in our closing song, there are some little baskets here up front. And when Mindy and I were talking about the service the other day, we said, you know, this is a good one for a souvenir. This is a good service for a souvenir. We have little rocks. And on the rock is a sticker that just says, no accusers. You might not need it now, but there may come a time you do. There may come a day when the old voices come back to haunt. Or there may come a day from things that you've done and people wanting to just go after you for your fault and make you believe I am a failure, that you'll need something to hold on to. You can just put in your hand, keep it in your car, keep it on your desk, something you can just rub and remember. Jesus says, I don't condemn you. No accusers. No accusers allowed between you and me. Maybe you know somebody you would like to get one for, and you want to hand it to them and tell them why you're giving it to them, what you believe about them. Let us pray. It is not an easy thing, Lord, to take you at your word. Sometimes it's really nice when we have people in our lives like a Mel Gibson or a Robert Downey Jr., who remind us of what is really true about us. We are not defined by our worst moments. We are defined by what looked like a worst moment for you. Your willingness to die on a cross for us because you believe in us that much. You love us and you forgive us. Help us remember the things we don't deserve in our lives, the voices that can play that tend to keep us from being our best. To hold on to your word that there are no accusers, and those voices are gone. And help us when we condemn ourselves for the things that we know we have done wrong, to trust that you are ready when we hug the cactus, when we acknowledge it, own it, claim it, that you stand ready to give us a new future and set us on our way. Amen.